All right, good afternoon, everybody. Today, my name is Stephen. I'm with the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. I am the current chair of the PALISI Clinical Research Coordinator Subgroup. And today we have a presentation on REDCap presented by Josie Hensley, who is one of our previous chairs and currently on one of the PALISI committee boards. And she's going to be talking about REDCap. So I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephen, and thanks everybody for joining. So I've titled today's presentation REDCap Gems. I think most of the coordinators in the network, maybe not everybody, I think most people have like a pretty basic understanding at least of how to build a REDCap project, how to add fields, edit fields, and things like that. So I wanted to take today to kind of go over some of the more in-depth features within REDCap. So you can see here some of the different topics we're going to cover. My plan is not to go over any individual feature in depth. It'll be like 2 or 3 slides on each. But to give you sort of an overview of what some of these different features are that you might think about adding or start utilizing in your REDCap projects, especially if you're maybe on the verge of starting to do like some multi-center builds and that sort of thing. But even if you're just doing single center or survey-based things, these are some things that you might be able to utilize, A, to help with the quality of the data and the cleanliness of the data upon export, so you can send it for analysis, but also to make it more visually appealing / organized, easier to enter on like the data entry side. And I feel like REDCap is one of those things, it varies so much from institution or teams in terms of what you need it for and how you utilize it, which is why I wanted to sort of like sprinkle in several different topics so you could have some ideas of things you might pick and choose. There might be 1 or 2 features that would be really applicable to you and how you use REDCap. And then there might be other features that aren't so applicable to what you do. So anyway, if you have any questions, because we're going to be moving through topic to topic, it's not necessarily going to build on each other. If you have questions within each topic, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask any questions as we move along. Okay, so the first thing that I was going to cover here is talking about project folders. This is just a way that you can organize your projects within REDCap, just so that you can find what you want easier. If you only have a couple of projects in REDCap under your like institution name, probably not going to be that helpful to you. But as you can see, I have many projects. And so being able to categorize them and create folders is a really helpful way to keep things organized. So as you can see here, so once you're on your main project page, you can click that little organize tab with the green folder. And then the right screen pops up where you can create your different folders. You can color your folders. And then the step 2 there, you can actually select a folder, and then you select all the projects you want under that folder. So you could actually, I haven't tried to do this, but I think it might be possible to have a project in 2 different folders, because you select the folder first and then the project that you want under that folder. So don't quote me on that, but I think that that's possible. So anyway, that's just a helpful way to kind of get organized when you get into REDCap, if that's something that's helpful to you. And I know Stephen's going to monitor the chat for us, but I know he has to drop off a little bit early. So after 1:30, if there are questions that come into the chat, if people could just maybe alert me so I can make sure that I get to them. Okay. So the next topic is I wanted to talk a little bit about moving your project to production. So something that I've seen at different institutions is that a coordinator will build a project and then keep it in the build status and start collecting data. So you can see here from the screenshot below on the far right column, you can see the status. So the little wrench is a project that's still in development status. and a project with the green checkbox is in production status. There are two different statuses, and they do serve specific purposes. So the development status is really designed for while you're building and testing. It does allow for changes to happen instantaneously. You can, create your variables and rename your variables. But it's not great for entering data while it's in production status, because you run a risk of actually like harming your data during that process. Because if during the course of data collection, you go back into your project and you change something, you do not have the safety features that are inherent within REDCap to keep you from potentially altering something that somebody else has already entered, because you're entering data while it's in production or while it's in development. So what I would recommend, and I think that is kind of like the standard practice among REDCap, is that if you're building your project, it's in development status. Once you want to start collecting real data, you need to move it to production. So you would go under your a project setup page and scroll all the way to down to the bottom and click move to production. So that is going to, again, just keep your data safe. Once it's in production, you can no longer change the variable name. So like, let's say I had a variable name of DOB for date of birth. I moved the project to production. Once it's in production, I can't go back and change that variable name from to like spelled out date of birth. It's going to stay date of B or DOB. So if you add, you can still edit your project even once it's in production. But again, the options for editing a project once it's in production, it does contain some sort of like fail safe. So it's usually pretty easy to add fields and then immediately like republish. And the new added fields, you can change those variable names because they're completely new fields. If you were to go back and edit a field that already existed in your project, typically what's going to happen is once then you try to republish that, it's probably going to kick back to your REDCap admins, and they're going to actually, they have protocol that they follow to check and make sure and then verify with you that you want that pushed through, because we want to make sure that we're not changing some of those back-end codes and what that actually means during data entry. So always move your project to production before you start entering data. Alerts and notifications. So this is a really fun one. So you can create all kinds of customized alerts within REDCap and email notifications based on different logic. So I've highlighted here some different ones that I personally use frequently. And actually you can get to this alerts and notifications on the left hand, that gray bar under applications, that alerts and notifications button. So some alerts that I typically set up: if a subject is enrolled, I get an alert. If a data form, not a data form, but so some of the projects that I run, so for example, Paradigm, there is a checkbox for if they've been entering patients' data and then they're saying, okay, all the data is complete, it's ready for query. There's like a form that they can check, yes, data is complete, right? As soon as that is checked, I get a notification, because that tells me that on my project management end, that patient is ready for query. And so I can kind of add them to my queue of patients to be queried. Whenever an IRB reportable event form is completed, I'll get an email about that. And then there might be some other ad hoc events. So, and that's just going to vary from study to study what it is that you need. But there are just so many different options for what it is that you would want to be notified of, rather than having to like actually go in and manually check all the time. And you can set up, I think I have shown on the next slide here, you can set up all the different logic that you want. And actually it does, you can see on most of these, I have it scheduled to send on the next weekday at 9 a.m., right? So I don't want my email inbox blowing up over the weekend or in the evenings, and I don't want to necessarily be getting emails like trickled in all throughout the day. So like I know at 9 a.m. every weekday morning, my inbox typically floods with all of the alerts that I have set. And then that just works as, for me, like a quick checklist. I can then go through my inbox, check off what I need to of these, and then I'm done. I don't even necessarily have to go into REDCap to check anything because I've already had that alert sent to my email. So this is when you're actually filling out one of those alerts, and like you're establishing a new alert. These are just the different fields that you go through. You can title it. You can set what it is that you want to trigger that alert, who that alert goes to, when that alert happens, how many times. So if it's a repeatable form, does it happen, or like every time that the form is saved, every time a new form is saved, only the first time? Kind of, and then even like the body of the email that is sent, you can set up that body language. So for example, you can see here for Paradigm, this is my alert for when a new subject is enrolled. And in the body here, it says the study ID, the consent date and time, and then what their MODS inciting diagnosis is, if the study team has already filled that out. This is sort of a little segue to piping, which we're going to get into next. You can see those little square brackets around my variable names of study ID, consent date and time, and final MODS. And that means that when I get the email, it will actually pull in that information from REDCap. So I'm not just getting the email and then I have to, like, sometimes you'll get these alerts, but you still have to go in and check some information, but you can also set up the alert so that it actually pulls in the things that you want to see. So now we'll move in a little bit to piping because that's also pretty fun. Okay, so we have a couple of different things. Oh, and I apologize. At the top right, I will send these slides out when I'm done. At the top right, I have actually added several links. These are typically either like a PDF, like an online PDF, or like a website that I feel like are a really good breakdown of some of these different topics. It's like kind of a one-stop shop user guide. So when I send these out, if there's any of these that you want to look into more, or you're trying to add this to your project, hopefully these links will be useful to you. Okay, so we have a couple of different things in REDCap that are a little bit similar, but a little bit different. We have piping and we have embedding. So piping is what we call when we want to display data that's entered elsewhere in the project, right? So, okay, so going back to date of birth. So let's say that in your data entry, you've entered a date of birth of February 1st, 2024. And you want that to display somewhere else so that somebody can see it later for whatever purpose. So that would be piping. So there's actually a way you can pull what they've already entered, you can pull that somewhere else so they can see it again. They can't change it from there. It's kind of a static field of being able to visualize what's already been entered. So that's piping. Embedding is where you're customizing where the data entry of a field is actually entered. This is more in terms of like giving you control over the look and feel of your project. So I'll show you a little bit of what I mean about both of these in a minute. But one of the reasons that they're similar is for both of them, you put brackets around the variable name. So if you remember in REDCap, your variable name is sort of the backend name, and then your field name is like what you want it to say. So maybe my backend name is like I see you admit, and then what shows in the project is please enter the date and time of admission, or something like that. So when you're piping, you're going to use the square brackets, and when you're embedding, you're going to use the curly brackets. All right, so we'll go a little bit more into each of those. So this is an example of piping a field. So I'm using the square brackets around the field itself, and this one's a little bit tricky because within this field, there's actually also an action tag that's a calculation. But so this is the back end view on the left, and then what they see during data entry on the right. So On the back end, I'm piping in, so I'm square bracketing the ICU admit. And then on the right-hand side is what they see during data entry. So if any of you do tropics, oh, actually this isn't tropics, this I think is bacon, but similar setup. So you've already entered the ICU admit date and time. And so now I'm going to set up these square brackets to actually pull in that ICU admit date and time, which shows then in the red on the right, if that makes some sense. So embedding is a little bit different in that this screenshot also shows how some things have been embedded. So again, in the blue bracket, or in the blue box down on the left, you can see that I have the lowest temp in curly brackets. So somewhere else on my project setup, I actually have defined like that field, right? So we have low temp in Celsius, and I might have my minimum, it's set as like a number, and I have it set to be maybe to have a minimum and a maximum, that sort of thing. So in this left hand, I'm embedding that field into this table that I've created because I'm trying to visualize it. And then on the right, when somebody is looking at it, now I can see it in sort of this table structure, as opposed to on the below screenshot, where you can see this is kind of the more typical REDCap data field structure, where it's just kind of like line by line. And you can tell that a field is embedded because, as you can see here on the bottom, you have that green little tag that sort of says field is embedded elsewhere on the page. So I don't have it, I should have maybe screenshotted this, but basically what this looks like when you're building your project, at least how I have mine set up. So typically, if I have a page like this, where I'm at the top, maybe I'm creating a table so that I can organize the data how I want it. And then below that, the whole rest of the page is all filled with these, this bottom screenshot you see. So like all the typical kind of REDCap fields. But then when somebody actually goes to enter data, they're not seeing all of those fields because they're embedded somewhere else. Anyway, I hope that this is making sense for people. There's a little bit of an assumption on my end that you have some idea of what I'm talking about. Another cool feature is you can actually embed a field within the field notation. So that's when you're editing your field, that's that bottom right, that field note. Sometimes people might use that field note for, okay, so let's say, well, even this example. So I have my field label, which is creatinine, and then in parentheses, I want them to give me the creatinine in mg per deciliter. So some people might actually just put creatinine and then put the mg per deciliter in the field note, right? So it's that little like notation just below your field where you can sort of like give some other instructions. So you can, it's sort of like a personal preference where you put things. But one other option is that you can actually specifically embed things in those field notes too. So one thing that I sometimes do, oh, and then I also highlighted this field embedding. When you open up the field to edit, REDCap has these all over the place that are really helpful. I use these all the time, in addition to YouTube. I know almost everything I know about REDCap from YouTube. So, but they have these nice little like how to do piping, how to field embed, and they'll give you like some examples and things like that. All right, so all right, so here is an example. So the top screenshot is, this is like often how I build things in REDCap. So you have your creatinine, and then there's an option for not done, right? Because I think we're all pretty familiar with, if you leave a field blank, does it mean because it's not done, or does it mean that somebody forgot to enter it, right? There's like, that's like a whole like data verification thing. So you don't really want to have blank fields. So any way that you can like build in a verification is really helpful on like the data cleaning side. So I try to think about these things proactively as I'm building a project. The second screenshot right below that shows that I've actually embedded that not done in this field note. So it kind of pulls it all together into like one field. It's just more streamlined. It works both ways. But it's just a matter of, like, again, user preference, visualizing things, dialing, customizing your REDCap build. Another thing that I really didn't get into with this presentation that we could potentially save for another one is that there is an option within REDCap to do a called like a missing data code. So it's another way to do this idea of not done. I like it and I don't like it. I tend to not use it a whole lot, in part because I'm like maybe not quite as familiar with it. But when I have used it, I'm a little bit on the fence about it. So, but that would be another way. Instead of the not done, you could use that missing data code feature to signify that there was just like no data available for them to enter, as opposed to they forgot to enter it. Oops. Oh, and I did add that there as a little text. Okay. Okay, so the next topic we'll get into is setting data limits. So again, this is it's a way to minimize having to do queries later. It's a way to sort of establish what your general standards are going to be for data entry. Again, it's just like a data cleanliness, data integrity, data cleaning sort of a thing. So the screenshot on the right shows when you've got that field editing open, right? So you're creating your field or you're editing your field. So as much as possible, I always recommend setting a validation. If you don't have, and that validation drop down, you'll see you'll have number, you'll have date and time, you'll have time, text, all email address. So there are all different kinds of things that you might have in that data validation. If you don't have that validation set, it defaults to text. And if you have, like this example for temperature, if I have that set to text, somebody could enter 32 degrees with the DEGREES, right? So it doesn't prohibit them, like you really only want a number. When you pull this data out to analyze it, you only want the actual like raw number. You don't want text in that field. So as much as you can, I would suggest setting a validation for all of your fields. So what is it that you want it to be? You can also set a minimum and a maximum. Oh, and you can also set like how many digits if you want it to have 2 decimals after, or whatever. You can set all of those different things. Anyway, but here you can set a minimum and a maximum. Particularly for a temperature, it's very helpful because if you don't have that set, let's say you're collecting temperature in Celsius. If you don't have a min-max set, somebody might just enter 98 because they're entering in Fahrenheit and they weren't really paying attention as they were going through, right? And they'll save it and then you have to go back later. If you have your mins and your max set, then when they try to enter 98, they're going to get an alert that pops up and they're like, oh shoot, that's right, I was supposed to convert that to Celsius. So just something that's really helpful on this end. Another thing below there is, do you want the field to be required? That is also very helpful. It kind of minimizes, again, that blank data. This does get a little bit tricky if it's a branching logic field. You can set branching logic fields as required, but there's like other data quality checks in REDCap that it can get a little bit tricky. But if there's no branching logic set and if you want something to be required, I would recommend making it required. You can also set things marked as identifiers. So if there's a date of birth in there, if there's a date of ICU admission, if there's a name or an MRN, you can signify that those are identifiers. And in that way, if you have people, let's say you can either assign certain people to not be able to see identifiers, or like when you export the data, you can export it like with or without the identifiers. And so setting those fields ahead of time, again, is like a data protection thing. And I saw a chat come through. When setting data limits and you add a min-max, what happens if you're out of the range? Yes, great question. So if you're out of the range, if you just have the min-max set here, it's what we consider, and I might even talk about this in a minute, but we'll just chat through it now. It's what's considered a soft limit. So let's say for my temperature, I set my min and max at 32 minimum and maximum of 44. We have a patient that was in the OR and they're being cooled and maybe their temperature is 30. You can still enter that 30. You'll get an alert on the data entry side, but you can still save it and move on. It's not really good. It's just a like, hey, heads up, red flag, but it's not really going to stop you. There are some things that we'll talk about in a minute that you can do to hard stop that. So for example, an FiO2, right? So FiO2 is only going to be between 21% and 100. Like there is no option outside of that range. You want that to be a hard limit. You don't want that to be a soft limit. So I will show you later how you can turn that soft limit here into a hard limit somewhere else. It does not, neither of these options auto-populate this as a query. Queries are sort of like a next step feature that we can do with some of this. In the field, oh yeah, so this is just, again, to remind people when you're building your project and you're setting your data limits, be very, very clear with people about what units you're expecting, right? So the example here, creatinine, and I gave those two options, the mgs per deciliter in the name or the mgs per deciliter in the field note. Either option, either place of putting that is great. So do you want something in Celsius or Fahrenheit, et cetera? So be as like dummy proof with your data as possible, and be very clear with people about what you want. Okay, action tags. So this is where we start to get into options for setting these hard limits over the soft limits. So, okay, I have found action tags in the last couple of years and they have changed my life and I love them. So I think that they're super fun. Okay, so let's take this race for example, right? So you're going to select all that apply when you're entering data, right? So they're going to select their race. Sometimes it's unknown or the parents choose not to report. But because this is a select all that apply, I don't want them to be able to select Hawaiian and unknown. Like those are in conflict with each other. You can't have both of those. But so there are things that you can do to keep that from happening using an action tag. So here is my field editing, this box pulled up into the editing. So at the bottom of all of these field edits, you'll see this action tag / field annotation. So this is where you're going to enter some different action tags. So like this specific action tag is called none of the above. And beware, these action tags do have to be all caps. If it's not all caps, it won't work. And if it's not written exactly the way that their action tags are set, it won't work. So what I do with this action tag is I put at none of the above equals whichever one I don't want them to be able to select and select something else, right? So for this example, 5 is my unknown not reported. So then my action tag is going to be at none of the above equals 5. And then you can see once you save that on the bottom left of your field, it's going to tell you that there's it's going to show like basically all of your action tags. So by setting this action tag now, if they select Hawaiian and unknown, like if they select Hawaiian and then they select unknown, it's going to automatically unselect Hawaiian. Or if they select unknown and then select Hawaiian, it's going to unselect unknown. And sometimes it'll give them like a little alert that'll pop up too. So that's a super fun one. And again, so at the bottom left, if you see that red action tags in red, where it says like learn about action tags. If you click that, it gives you the entire list of all of the action tags that are available within REDCap, and it'll give you a little bit of information about how to use them. Some of them you might have to Google a little bit more because some of the action tags are like calculation based, which can get pretty confusing. But anyway, that's something that you can kind of play around with. All right, so here's that, what we talked about before. We're going to force a min and a max set. So there's one study that I worked on that I forgot to set the min max, the force, the making it a hard stop when I set up the project and had to go back later and do it. But so this was a study where we were only enrolling patients that were up to a year old, and they weren't entering a date of birth. They were like, it was like a no PHI kind of a study. And so they were having to calculate, enter the age. So again, in your field edit, under your validation, you have to set your min max. So my minimum is 0, my maximum is 12. And then in the action tag section, I'm going to hit @force-min max. And then that's going to turn that into a hard stop. And when they go to enter, when they enter that data, like it won't let them save that form with that data. I think it just won't save it, or it will like push it back to 0, but it gives them like a strict alert, like you can't save this form because of that forced min max. Yeah, just explaining what we've already talked about here. So I'm not going to go through the whole list, but I'll just kind of let you know. So some other common action tags that I tend to use. There's one called hidden. So you can actually hide a field. Sometimes where I use this is when, let's say we've had a case report form that's been in play for a while, and we've decided we actually want to do away with a field, but you don't, like deleting data is like a major no-no. So you want to delete data that's already been entered. So you can actually just hide the field. So it still lives in the cloud of REDCap, but when people go to enter data now, they're not going to see that field. Sometimes I also use it. I tend to create a lot of fields for organization purposes, and for I create a lot of action tags with calculations in them. So I actually don't want users to see it. It's more from an aesthetic build end, but I need it to be there for whatever functional purpose so I have it. So I might hide that field for that sort of purpose. There's a hide choice. Similar to the option above, this is where, let's say you have a multiple choice field and you want to retire one of those choices. You can actually set an action tag, again, to not delete the data that's already been entered, but so that choice will no longer show up. I think it actually shows up as a grayed out, so they can't select it. Calc date will perform a date calculation. So we'll talk a little bit about calculated fields in a minute. So there's kind of some different ways to do some calculations. Using calculations and action tags gives you a little bit more, I think, functionality. And anyway, we'll get into that in a minute. And then at default. So using the default, you can actually default a field to a given value unless the user changes it. So that's another option. But again, use the user guide, check out the learn more about action tags that shows up. They're kind of fun to learn about and see what you can implement in your project to make it better. Okay, so calculated fields. Calculated fields are there to allow you to do real-time calculations during data entry, but there are some limitations and alerts that you should be aware of. So calculated fields only work during the form entry on which the field is placed, meaning if I'm actively entering data on the field, the calculation happens, and then I save the form. If you go back and either do an import of data, that will mess with your calculation. And importing data is a whole nother topic that we can talk about at a different time. But also if if you've had a project in place for a minute and then you want to go back and add a calculated field, any data that's already done up to that point, that calculated field will no longer, it won't like back calculate for all of those forms that are already entered, right? So like I've had times where I have done a calculated field and I didn't realize until after several patients were in that calculated field, there was actually an error in my calculation. So I needed to go back and change it. But that means that for everybody else that was entered, I would have to manually go back through, click into and resave that form. Like doing that manually over multiple records is just doesn't even make sense. So that is one limitation. I would say typically I only like to use calculated fields if the calculation is necessary for the user to see for the purposes of doing data collection in that moment. We'll talk a little bit more in a minute about I'll go in depth on that in a minute more. So too many calculated fields during data entry can actually slow down your REDCap project and have also been known to completely shut down entire projects. So the biggest alert there is don't overuse calculated fields. That's kind of a big no-no. Do not rely on calculated fields for data analysis. So sometimes I'll see what people will do is they'll have the data, they'll ask people to enter the date of birth and then the date of ICU admission, and then create a calculated field to generate the age in months and years. But if they don't need to know the age in months and years at the time of data entry, just don't even, like those calculated fields will do you no good. They could end up potentially causing problems down the road. Like the best way from like an analysis side of things is that if you have calculations that you need for analysis, do that after you have exported your data and you're doing that calculation either in Excel or in some other statistical software that's being used. So don't add calculated fields if you don't actually need it at the time, if you're only using it for later. The calculation formats are typically based off of like an Excel style calculation logic, but they do use those square brackets around the variable names. So it's as if you're like piping, again, those square brackets are for piping, the curly brackets are for embedding. So it's like you're piping the data in and then using that pipe to do your calculation. Oh my gosh, we're already at 45 minutes, guys. This might be like, I already might have a part 2 here because I don't know if I'm going to get through all this. So here's an example of a calculated field. So in the paradigm study, which is one of the studies that I run, the users need to know the PF ratio in order to determine if the patient has respiratory dysfunction criteria, right? So like I have that calculation in there because that is a reference point that I'm asking users to use to determine something else. So I just have an example pulled up here of what my calculated equation looks like in REDCap. It is truly just about as simple as like my PaO2 divided by my FiO2 with, you know, kind of hugged in some brackets. But I did add the rounding in there. So you have options for like the one tells you like how many decimals to round to, basically. Just to make it so you don't get like, you know, 35 point and then like 10 other numbers. So again, it's just more of like an aesthetics thing. So these are some like just screenshotted from this link that I have above on how you can do some different calculations. I think the one other thing that I forgot to, oh no, I have it on the next slide. Calculated fields only yield numbers. So if you want, you can calculate other things, like to yield other things, but you have to use an action tag for that. A calculation field will only spit out a number. Okay, and so this is an example of an action tag using a calculation. So again, it's using that like piping it, like calculating a specific date and then piping it. So in this example, everything is basically based off of like the sepsis onset date. So the calculation in our action tag is we are calculating the sepsis onset date plus like sepsis onset date and then day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, right? So you can actually like calculate with all of that and then have it spit out the date that you want. So what that looks like here is that like I have my calculation. It looks like it's a calculated field, but it's actually not a calculated field. It's a descriptive field with an action tag for calculating a date. And then you can see to the right, this is basically what it has pulled up for me based on what I've entered somewhere else as like, you know, 8-1 or whatever it was. So I'm going to make this one sort of, I think, the last topic for today so that we can have so many questions at the end. There is a whole piece of functionality in REDCap called data quality. This is, again, something that helps you to just pre-establish limits for your data to double check things. This is only something that I've really even started using. Well, actually, I think it's only even been around in REDCap for a little while. Well, no, it's been longer. Sorry, I'm processing through some different things. But so anyway, but I've only started using this in the last couple of years. And I've started implementing on, like I manage a ton of projects through Nationwide Children's. We have a bunch of local things and some multi-center studies as well. And I have actually started even like our most basic local investigator initiated studies. I have started doing very extensive data quality because human error happens, right? So like if you enter, like some of the common things that I check for are that the date of birth isn't after the hospital admission, right? Like that's a super common one that I see. Or that the times on sample collection logs don't make sense. Or you said that the patient was intubated 12 days after ICU discharge or something like that. So it's just a whole way for like checking your data and verifying things within your data. So there's data quality tab that you can access under that application bar. There are some preset data quality rules in REDCap that you can't change. And they're pretty cool. You can run them. This is one of those things where if you are setting required fields, this is where you have to get careful with if it's a branching logic field, because it'll kind of mess up how this is run. But essentially, you can run a report on any field that you have designated as required, but it's blank. You can hit that execute button, and it will run a report, and it'll show you all the fields where and patient records where that has happened. You can look for outliers. You can look at, there's all different kinds of stuff. That I don't tend to use the preset ones very much. I tend to create my own at the bottom where it shows add. And I'll show you an example on the next page. So here's one that I set up a data quality on all of my projects. So you set up the rule name. So I've titled it date of birth after hospital admission, and then the rule logic. And again, it's a similar type of calculation that is used in the action tags, in the calculated fields, and in Excel. So it's pretty similar logic to all of that. And most of these calculations I've sort of learned through time of like Googling things. But basically this calculation will alert me if those dates don't appear correct. So then you can see a column that says real-time execution. So you can check or uncheck this. And that just means, do you want it to run this check for the user while they're entering data? For most of mine, I have them set to yes. For some of them, I have set to no based on whatever it is that I'm looking at. But even if it has set an alert to the user, you can still click that execute button when you're checking your data and see if that rule was still broken. Anyway, and then below you can see there's like a screenshot of on the user end. If you have that real-time execution checkbox, and what they have entered has like breached that rule, this is the alert that they'll see basically. So it'll tell you like what the rule name is and what the fields are that are involved. I shouldn't have said all that stuff to animate, but oh, and that was the end anyway. Okay, perfect. Not so bad timing anyway, then. So some other topics that we could talk about kind of on future presentations are importing, exporting data, setting up reports, working with a data dictionary. So if you're building a big project, you can do everything in REDCap in the designer, but you can also, typically I'm usually doing a back and forth of doing things in the designer, and then I actually export the data dictionary, and then I fudge in there, and then I re-upload it, and then I keep working, and I do this sort of back and forth, and it can actually save you a ton of time, because you can do a lot more like copying and paste. So those are some different things that if people are interested in, like a part 2, the more advanced stuff that we could get into another time. And I've obviously put some resources here if you're interested in learning more. These are the few YouTube channels that I tend to use the most. Most of them even have sort of broken down like basics, intermediate, and advanced REDCap. So if you just want to learn more, you could kind of start through some of those like basic videos, and then once you kind of get a handle on that, kind of move through some of the different levels that they have, and they're really fun. But if you have any questions about like any of these different topics, especially as you're building a project, please always feel free to utilize me as a resource. I have a lot of fun with REDCap. It's like one of my favorite parts of my job. And it's just a lot of trial and error and playing with things, and you'll build a project and then 5 years down the road go like, oh, that was the worst project I've ever built, because you've learned so many new things along the way. So it's really fun because you get to kind of see your own project and do it the way you want it. Thank you, Kristen. So are there any questions that I can answer? Cool. Okay. Well, thank you guys for coming, and hope you have a great weekend. We're almost there. Today's Thursday, so 1.5 more days, guys. Take care.